Time for Mariam and I now to have a look at the stories making headlines around the world this morning. And we start with this. Don't look down, says the Times, summing up the carnage caused by panic selling on the global markets. The paper says plummeting values are fueling fears of a new recession in the West.
France's Le Figaro says the International Monetary Fund is standing by its leader, Ms Lagarde, who's facing an investigation over allegations of abuse of power.
Real Politico, just a change of heart. The Moscow Times is saying the Kremlin has decided to throw its support behind that UN condemnation of Syria's crackdown on protests following Sunday's violent attacks on the city of Hama.
Well, the China Daily says Japan's latest defense white paper is causing a stir, with Beijing accusing Tokyo of playing up what it calls a China threat theory.
Now, the UK's Daily Telegraph reports on the discovery of what scientists think may be channels of water on Mars, raising hopes of finding life on the red planet.
And the Gulf News says mobile phones in Egypt are ringing with the words of former President Hosni Mubarak. His statement, "I completely deny all these charges," at his murder and corruption trial has been turned into a wildly popular ringtone.
Now, Bundeep Rangar, chairman of IndusView, is here with us now to go through the papers. And we're starting with, of course, the story of the day. It's not just the story of the day, is it? It's the story of our time, pretty much.
Absolutely. It's worldwide. I guess this is a fear that's set into the market, and the biggest fear about fear is fear itself. And you've seen with the statements made in the Eurozone, the ECB president, and the potential less than impressive numbers that might come out of the States today on payroll figures, particularly non-farm payroll figures, is what's setting this into motion. Not least also because of the delay that we found in the U.S. House to get a resolution on the debt ceiling raise. That just was a catalyst for saying, do they have the political will to solve the economic problems? And I think that's a key thing here, because you look at the way, for example, Britain's dealt with the financial mess here and put some tough austerity measures, and we're in a relatively better position than, say, the peripheral Eurozone states like Spain, Portugal, Italy, where it's been a lot harder to make those decisions because there's greater political consequences.
And I was reading earlier in the week that the boss of Barclays talking about Britain now being almost a safe haven compared to the Eurozone and the US. I mean, these US numbers coming out later are crucial, aren't they?
Absolutely, and the market's going to watch that very actively, and that's what's going to be a trigger point for either a calming effect and certainly flooring out of the market. And there's some signs that in Asia it could just be bargain hunting on behalf of stock buyers, but it could also lead to potentially a greater precipice that we might fall into, which we certainly want to avoid.
Now, a lot of people are, an increasing number it must be said, are now warning of this being the critical moment, the moment that we witnessed back in 2008. How far away are we, would you say, from the Lehman Brothers moment now?
I see, back in 2008, the Lehman moment was a seminal moment, because that was such a venerable institution that just collapsed, and a near collapse of Merrill until it was bailed out of Bank of America. But in that case, what happened was it was a cascading of a reality setting in that assets on banks' balance sheets, particularly those related to the real estate sector and the securitization of that in the form of credit, collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, were just overvalued, and therefore the banks' balance sheets were overvalued, and that led to the cascade.
That's what's happening now.
Right now it's different, fundamentally different. Now it's about the economy not kickstarting itself again. And despite measures, austerity measures, structural changes, either they've not gone far enough, or we've maybe lifted off the patient off the operating table before the procedure is complete. And
the politics has been interesting as well, because a lot of people are also pointing to what is quite clearly a failure of political leadership.
Absolutely, and when you have 9% unemployment rate in the United States, that's not a good bedrock to get re-elected against. Britain, I think, is again slightly better. We've got, I think, another budget coming out that'll probably be more corporate friendly. But yeah, it's a political will issue as much as it's an economic one.
I mean, why is it you have José Manuel Barroso intervening, presumably to try to help, to try to restore a certain amount of confidence, but actually it has exactly the opposite effect, doesn't it?
It's disunity, isn't it?
It's disunity, and it's kind of a bit of a blame game, right? So they're saying it's the political guys who haven't made the right decisions. Now they're interfering, and even the ECB buying bonds in kind of, not what's a violation, but against the wishes of the Bundesbank in Germany. It kind of shows tension internally. Whenever people sense tension and uncertainty, that leads to the market getting a little panicky.
Now let's talk about this article in the Figaro, the front page. We're talking obviously about the IMF leader Christine Lagarde, who's now facing investigation of allegations over abuse of power.
You know what? I can't help believe this is a bit of a left-wing political party conspiracy being played out in France. I just think that she was arbitrating a case that was not, it was not something that was out of her domain as minister where she was at the time. I do believe it's kind of this conspiracy about politicians colluding with business people. I don't think there's any substance to it. That's my personal view, of course. I just think that she's been blamed because she's got this new position.
This is a scandal involving the disgraced tycoon, Bernard Tapie.
Indeed, yeah.
When he sold Adidas and supposedly sold it to a bank that then made double the money a year later by reselling it.
But the interesting thing is the IMF is pretty resolute in saying it retains confidence in her. It has no choice, presumably.
Well, it has no choice, although it makes you wonder if somebody will go for that coveted IMF seat that quickly anymore, or go on the back of two people who get accused of things that may or may not be true.
Now, moving on to the Moscow Times, and it seems as though events in Hama at the weekend have proved to be the turning point, and Russia has finally come off the fence when it comes to Syria.
They kind of had to, because for a while they were lobbying some of the other Security Council permanent and temporary members to join their camp and not be that interventionist in terms of making statements against Syria. But having not succeeded, if you can't beat them, join them. And so Russia's joined in that condemnation, and they really can't afford not to, given the 1,400, 1,500 deaths that people suspect or estimate have happened in places like Dara, where, if you remember, 30 years ago, about 10,000 people estimated to have been killed by the current Syrian president's father. So it's there to lose if they stand isolated. Having said that, what this does do, because at the end of the day, it's only as good as the teeth behind it, and what this does allow to do is further the economic sanctions, because that's the only real benefit per se that you can get out of it in terms of condemnation of Syria, and both the Eurozone countries and the United States now are upping their sanctions against Syria. So that's the one catalyst. Short of that, there's no military intervention coming anytime soon.
It's pretty interesting, is it? Because a lot of people suggest that Syria is suffering as a result of Libya and the West's engagement with Libya.
And that's one reason why the protesters there locally have categorically said they do not want Western military intervention. This is a local thing, and they'd rather have peaceful protests to bring about change.
Now let's look at the China Daily newspaper, an article about Japan and China. China's criticizing Japan's latest defense white paper. It says it plays up the threat from China. I mean, this is quite interesting, isn't it, the way that Japan is viewing the Chinese, and what's going on in particular around China's maritime plans?
Well, China's emerged now as the second largest spender on defense, right? And the estimates officially are close to about 100 billion. The unofficial estimates from Western think tanks is close to about 150, which takes about sort of 1.5% to 2% of its GDP. So as a percent of GDP, it's not insanely high compared to some other countries, but it is the second largest spender. And guess who gets most affected by it? Well, its immediate neighbor. It's a lot tinier, where there's been a history of conflict. So yes, again, it's a bit of the, we're getting surrounded by Chinese military might as they build more warships, et cetera, but to some extent it's also an extent of just China's global ambitions, not necessarily just regional ambitions.
Now, I don't know how excited you are by the prospect of there being life on Mars, but this is a question that's engaged us, isn't it, forever.
Pickles comes to mind, because the water they're suspecting is brine, right? It's not, it's
salt water.
Salt water, stuff you use to pickling onions. So it's not quite water. And that's probably why they suspect the seasonality in the appearance. So they suspect that, one, it's salt water, and secondly, it's underground. So it kind of comes out of these craters during the winter, appears and disappears after that. Look, we've had all these theories and people get fascinated about it. We'll find out in due course. And we said that they did find specks of brine on some spacecraft that went in there, so that's what leads to the suspicion, beyond just visual observation.
There's still hope then.
Yeah, and pickles after that.
Now then, I suppose the scenes we've witnessed this week in Cairo of former President Mubarak on a stretcher in a cage on trial in Cairo have been absolutely extraordinary. And now for us to hear that, as being reported by the Gulf News, that his denial of the charges against him have turned into a very popular ringtone.
Everything always turns into a ringtone eventually, doesn't it? I find that very annoying, actually.
Right, the ringtones absolutely. But what it does tell you is the serious high degree of connection between political events and social media, and the almost synchronous impact of one event being communicated to the mass public. And look at Facebook, their biggest uptake now outside the United States is India because of the mobile phone revolution there.
And almost it's a way of ridiculing him even more, isn't it, really, using something as a ringtone?
Ridiculing him, or certainly keeping on top of what's going on and mocking it, but is the topic of interest. And the fact that they're not postponing this trial, it's not something that's going to be delayed. They've said it'll have consecutive hearings to come to a conclusion, so the military can interfere, for example, and postpone it until the next 10 years and maybe he dies instead of getting convicted, is what I think has got the popular imagination going there.
Just out of interest, what's your most irritating ringtone? I can tell you what mine is. Mine is that, you know, the baby chuckling? That drives me insane. What's your worst?
Probably something out of Mission Impossible, because I've heard it too many times.
Yours, the crazy frog, can't stand it.
Bundeep, thank you very much indeed for going through the newspapers with us here at BBC World News, and thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Bye-bye.